Hey, Jonah.
Hey, Peter. How's it going?
Good. We haven't chatted in a while, but now the summer is over. We're both back to our respective home bases, so we're going to do some just a lot of sheer rank punditry.
Yes, and at first I owe you an apology because this summer I actually recorded a Blogging Heads with Bob Wright, and I felt so dirty doing it.
You should Blogging Heads adultery.
It is. It's outrageous.
Yet another example of social conservatives not practicing what they preach.
That's right. I felt like I should have been doing it from a motel room. All right, so why don't we just jump into it? State of the race. I'll start, I guess.
Okay.
Things are looking good for McCain. The Mac is back, as some might say. Who knows if it's going to last or anything like that, but if you look at the polls, McCain is either tied or in the lead for the first time since these sort of numbers would make any sense. He on InTrade, the online market prediction markets thing, he's the first time over 50%. This USA Today poll says he's doing better. It says he's leading with likely voters by like 10 points, which I think everybody agrees is probably crazy. But at the same time, Rasmussen says that he closed the gender gap from 14 points to 3 points. The Real Clear Politics average has McCain up 2.1 points, which is really kind of huge. And generally, I think the excitement and momentum is on the McCain side of the ledger right now.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's a funny moment because liberals and Democrats are basically pessimists. They have this generation of them. I'm sure it wasn't the case, a generation earlier or 2 generations earlier. But basically, people who came of age in the kind of 70s and 80s, and then again after 9/11, basically are pessimistic. If you get them around, grouped together, they'll tend to say, "How are we going to screw this one up?" And conservatives and Republicans, it seems to me, may be particularly pessimistic in the last 2 or 3 years, but it seems to me, in broader sweep, they're more likely to be optimistic. They've just seen more elections won than liberals have. And the thing that I've noticed in the last few weeks is that it didn't really take much for liberals and Democrats, at least the ones that I knew, to basically say, "Here we go again. We're going to lose." I think the difference here compared to in 2004, let's say, is there's less blaming of Barack Obama and more blaming of America. Frankly, I think if Obama loses, I think the dominant view amongst many Democrats and certainly many liberal Democrats, whether it gets how come overly pessimistic, I still think that I think that Obama still has the edge in the race, and I think if you look state by state, I'm not as kind of geeky into every state poll as some are, but it just seems to me Obama's still playing offense in a lot of places. I saw NBC says that the McCain campaign is advertising in North Carolina. If you look at the states that Kerry won, that McCain has a shot at winning, they're very, very few and far between. Maybe Michigan. I think Pennsylvania would be a real shocker if McCain won there. And so I think that Obama still has a better chance of winning Bush states than McCain has of winning Kerry states.
Yeah, a couple of quick reactions. One is, if you go to the Real Clear Politics electoral map, as of today when we're recording this, and these things are very fluid, and I think you're right that that a lot of liberals are overly pessimistic because I think this thing's going to turn around a bunch of times. But if you go to it, you use the leaning McCain, leaning Obama thing, and you put them in the respective camps, Obama has a 0.3 lead in New Hampshire and a 0.3 lead in Colorado. And if McCain flipped those two, McCain would
holds everything else.
Yeah. He would have a sizable win in the Electoral College. Actually, he could lose New Hampshire and still win in the Electoral College.
NBC also does one of these things, Chuck Todd and those guys, and they have a new one out today which still shows Obama ahead given the states that they look at.
Yeah, again, I agree with all that. But I think in terms of momentum, I think it looks like McCain has momentum right now. Again, could change. Obama looks defensive on the it's American racism that did it kind of thing. I I think it'd be a fool to say that race doesn't play an issue. Obviously it does. But the question is whether it's at the margins or not. If it's this incredibly tight race and McCain squeaks it out, I think there would be some reason to point to the racial thing. At the same time, Obama's been way ahead in these polls, right? So if McCain just flips the people, these independents who have been leaning Obama back into the McCain camp, you can't really blame racism if he loses the people who once were for him, right? I mean, it's not like all of a sudden these people who were going to vote for Obama in April, May, June, July, and August all of a sudden become racists because they didn't at the wire.
Yeah, but the thing is that, and I think this is what's baffled and disheartened so many Democrats, is that Obama never really has built up a really big lead. I mean, if you look at where the partisan generic difference is, you ask people, do you want to vote for a Democrat or Republican for Congress without giving their names? Democrats have had consistently double-digit leads. I think they have a double-digit lead in partisan identification now. And yet, Obama's lead has always been pretty small. I mean, maybe at its highest right after the Democratic Convention, it was in the high single digits. But it's mostly been in the mid or low single digits. So I think for many Democrats and even some Republicans, the puzzle of the race has been why Obama has been so significantly underperforming the generic advantage that Democrats seem to have, even when he had a small lead.
I think I agree it's a puzzle, and I agree that race is part of it, but, there are other factors in here. Here's a guy with very little experience on the national stage. He's a very exotic guy, and I don't mean that as code for race, right? With an exotic name, which has, again, not code for race. But that's
difficult. I understand what you're saying, but it's difficult to disentangle that from race.
I agree. My problem is that a lot of liberals won't even try, is that they will immediately go to the race thing and want to blame it on racism because that nurtures and sustains their a certain self-righteous sort of self-identification as the forces of truth and justice, and if we only had a better country that deserved Barack Obama. And I think that if Barack Obama were a white guy and said a lot of the things he said, had a wife who said a lot of the things he said, had the exact same record, that white guy would be certainly if he was named Barack Obama, would be underperforming the generic Democrat as well.
Well, I think first of all, I don't think Democrats are the only people who tend to blame America when they lose. I think if you go back to the late 1990s when Republican impeachment failed, conservative impeachment, there was a fair amount of this kind of country's going to hell in the handbasket because people have lost their moral, the ability to. But, I think it's very difficult. I think you're making a good point in that I think that it's very hard to disentangle unwillingness to vote for Barack Obama because he's an African American and unwillingness to vote for Barack Obama because he seems foreign, which is not the same kind of problem that a Jesse Jackson or an Al Sharpton would have, or a Harold Ford even. And so even you could argue that even Michael Dukakis, let's say, maybe it hurt him a little bit that he was considered a little bit culturally exotic. We've never actually even elected an American of kind of Slavic or Southern European descent, right? Remember how, even that we've never done. One Catholic, and he was an Irish Catholic. So I think that Obama does have I think that the name and the fact that he grew up in places that a lot of Americans don't have much experience plays into it. But it's so difficult to it's so difficult to figure out. I think what we can say is that if Obama loses, it's not because white liberals and African Americans are not going to vote for him in large numbers. It's going to be because he underperforms amongst white working class voters, and it's states that don't have that are overwhelmingly white working class and don't have a lot of white liberals, like Ohio, for instance, or West Virginia. Or Arkansas, where he's really struggling. And for those people, maybe experience is a factor, but it's worth noting that those people have voted for a lot of inexperienced candidates before, including Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush.
Yeah, again, I think it's all fair. I think there are a bunch of Venn diagrams, and one of them has the word blackness in it, or black, or whatever. Yeah. But there are a lot of other ones as well. He has... there's a sort of a cultural haughtiness that comes with Obama.
But what does that mean?
I'm sorry?
Explain that to me. What is cultural haughtiness? What's culturally haughty about him? That he went to Harvard?
In the same way that John... A similar way to that he had that John Kerry had, and to a certain extent Michael Dukakis had. There's this whole, people of Earth, stop your bickering. I'm Barack Obama and I'm here to help. There's this sort of, I wrote this whole piece of the New York Post with all these quotes by him that sounded awfully arrogant to me. I think, and I don't mean that as code for uppity, as I'm sure people at Slate or someone is going to write. I mean it as arrogant. I think John Kerry was incredibly arrogant.
But look, okay. But again, I guess the problem is that it's so difficult to define what arrogant means in in some kind of neutral way. Take George W. Bush, right? A lot of people would say, even people like George W. Bush, that there's more than a little arrogance in George W. Bush.
No, there's a lot of arrogance. He's cocky. I don't dispute that for a heartbeat.
But do you feel like that alienated? That would. I didn't hear a lot of conservatives bemoaning that in 2000 or 2004.
No, but that's fine. But I think you're grabbing apples to defend oranges here. I don't dispute that Bush was arrogant, but I think when you keep saying over and over again how difficult it is to disentangle the black thing from all these other factors, I think what you're really revealing is that it's very difficult for you. I don't think it's very difficult, and maybe it's not difficult enough for me, and that's a criticism of me, and we can have that introspection some other day. But it seems to me that there are all sorts of things that when you're talking about the voter at the margins, not in the base. There were a lot of voters at the margins who were turned off by George Bush's cockiness. There were a lot of voters at the margins who were turned off by John Kerry's smugness. There were a lot of voters at the margins turned off by all sorts of things. And since it's the voters at the margins who decide these elections, it seems to me not as persuasive as people like Jake Weisberg are going to want to make it into saying that it was these voters at the margins who ultimately relied on their racism. I don't think that's going to be nearly as clear cut as a lot of people sort of feather bedding the defeat are trying to make it out to be.
Well, I agree that it's difficult to argue fundamentally because people don't say that. So you have to. So what I think a lot of people who make that argument, including, and I've made that argument too, do is they kind of work backwards and they basically say, are there enough other weaknesses in Barack Obama to suggest that if there wasn't this race would be where it is? And of course, the problem with that, of course, is that Democrats are just more likely naturally to not see the other aspects of Barack Obama as weaknesses.
Sure.
I think you can. Clearly, Obama's non-racial weaknesses are his lack of experience and the fact that he's a liberal Democrat, not a conservative Democrat. And I think my own reading of the race is, given how much a desire there is for change, how open Americans have been to electing non-experienced candidates before, and the fact that I think the country is very open to some kind of ideological change, I don't see in this environment being relatively inexperienced and being relatively liberal, particularly because I think a lot of the cultural issues have faded a little bit, would explain why we're in a deadlocked race. But, and the haughtiness thing is just so subjective. I don't really see that in Obama. I kind of see a guy who is, I just see a guy who's very talented, who's been very, very successful in his life because he's very, very good at the things a politician needs to be good at. But these things are so subjective that it's difficult for me even to sometimes understand what people mean when they say that he thinks he's God.
But look, you could flip it completely around. I think Colin Powell, if he hadn't had the taint of the Bush administration on him, right, and he were running as a Republican, we would have our first black, president in 2009. Barack Obama is a very liberal Democrat who campaigns as a very liberal Democrat. A lot of his talk about post-partisanship and all that kind of stuff doesn't withstand the kind of scrutiny in the general election that it could brush aside in the primaries. It just seems to me that it's so much less of a cut and dried racial thing that what kind of bothers me is this. There's almost. I'm not trying to say that race has nothing to do with it. I think I've been very clear about that. What bothers me is there's this kind of eagerness to say it's all about race. This sort of almost. I'm sure the Germans have a word for it, like Schadenfreude. This sort of, yes, we failed because we because we're fighting for truth and justice for this black guy, and we're sort of anointed because of our failures. There's a martyrdom thing going on here, and you read people like Weisberg, who had a piece in Slate about this. You read I don't want to mess up her name, but it's Ali something in the Philadelphia Daily News, who basically said if Obama loses, we're going to have race wars. Or you read Dick Pullman in the Philadelphia Inquirer, who basically wrote about this. All of them, they write about it as if it is this monocausal thing, and I just think it's one variable among a great many, and it probably explains more than I think it does, and a great deal less than what a lot of liberals think it does.
Well,
anyway, we didn't even plan on talking about this. You can have your last thought on this, and then we should probably move on.
I think the Colin Powell thing is really interesting. I originally was of the same view as you, that Colin Powell would walk to the presidency, but it's interesting. Colin Powell, first of all, I don't think, maybe this is a separate issue, but, Colin Powell is pro-choice, so first of all, how would he have gotten the Republican nomination? He's also pro-affirmative action. And so I don't know how that would have played. It would have certainly required Republicans to swallow a lot to nominate Colin Powell. And I also think that I would like to be optimistic about Colin Powell, but I also think, we don't know if Colin Powell were actually this close to being the presidency, how much racial stuff there would have emerged with Colin Powell. It's one thing to really like the guy when he's head of the Joint Chiefs or something like that. It's another thing when he actually gets really close to the presidency.
Fair enough. I have response to that, but we should move on.
Okay, we're going to talk about the conventions.
The conventions, yes.
So what do you think?
I went to the... I watched the Denver one on TV and/or listened to it on XM radio while driving. And I went to the Republican convention. So, one technical point. I think that the Denver convention was very well planned. The spectacular thing on that final night with Obama worked, at least in terms of theatrics and all of that. I think the Republican convention was, in fact, the worst. I've been to 6 Republican conventions. Was the worst orchestrated convention I have ever been to in either party. It was really astounding just how bad it was at the technical level. And if McCain had not picked Palin, if he had picked Pawlenty or Ridge or, heaven forbid, Lieberman, it would have looked like a neutron bomb had gone off in there because everyone would have passed out asleep how bad it was. It was Palin that added that excitement, and I think it's just another reason why McCain lucked out with the pick. In general, I thought the conventions were interesting. I kind of like listening to the conventions as if the people putting them on actually mean what they say, rather than like all this punditry you get about whether did this work to sway Catholics or independents or hermaphrodites from Rhode Island or whatever. The sort of fine-tuning dog whistle interpretations of these things kind of bores me. And what I thought was sort of interesting is that these people who say there's not a dime's worth of difference between the parties wouldn't know it from actually listening to what these people have to say. Certainly Barack Obama's speech was profoundly progressive and sort of Herbert Crowleyite and very democratic, very liberal, in part because he's trying to be, as we said in the last segment, he's trying to catch up with the generic Democrat, I think. But, my favorite line of either convention was Hillary Clinton's, where she said that she ran first and foremost to stand up for all those people who feel like they've been invisible to the government for these last 8 years. And I can tell you, most conservatives would love to be invisible to their government. It's a very it's an interesting thing. I thought the Democrats made a real mistake, again maybe at a dog whistle kind of level, in the way they talk about the troops, in the way they talk about Americans, the way they talk about America as if it's a Great Depression and a Dust Bowl all over again. There's a lot of grapes of wrath kind of stuff. Biden talking about the flickering lights in Delaware as if they don't have electricity. And you get this real downer about America. They talk about or the state of America. They talk a lot about supporting the troops. They talk a lot about giving the troops what they need, and that's all great. Give the troops what they need. They don't almost to a person didn't talk about victory. They almost didn't talk about, and they almost none of them. I think Bill Clinton or Hillary, one of them, said that we need to bring the troops home with honor, but almost no one else did. And at the Republican convention, I mean, it was so palpable, the difference. Lindsey Graham, at one point in his speech, just says, victory. You're allowed to say the word victory at the Republican convention, and it was really on display how the Republicans talked about soldiers as if they were heroes who might actually want to win, rather than sort of lumpen proletariat dupes who are now in need of mental health care. It was a really sort of stark contrast.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there. I agree with you. I mean, I wasn't at either, actually, but I agree with you that just watching the Republican convention, I think there's a little bit of a tendency in the Bush era for Democrats to talk about Republicans as these, technical wizards. A lot of it comes out of the Rove thing, the kind of Rove evil genius. He can find, left-handed people who go to Applebee's and order the bacon burger, and he knows that they're going to vote on the environment or something. And I think it just showed how much of that technical wizardry was a Bush-related thing. That actually the McCain campaign has generally been kind of poorly run. I mean, it's made, and I thought the McCain speech in general, just at a technical level, I thought was awful. I mean, I thought that he delivered it poorly. I thought the background was bizarre. I even thought they didn't even seem to manage to get the protesters out of the way very fast. I mean, that was what bizarre. I mean, there's one stereotype the Democrats have of Republicans. It's that if a left-wing protester shows up at a Republican, they're likely to be, sent to Guantanamo Bay. And as far as I could tell, these guys were one of the guys just seemed to be hanging out there for minute after minute after minute without even. So anyway, I agree with you on that stuff. I think that it's no question that the Democrats talked less about Iraq, a lot less about Iraq, than you would have expected them a year ago too. And I think even to some degree the Republicans did. I thought McCain's speech would be very focused on, we want victory in Iraq, they don't. I supported the surge. And I think that the conventional wisdom in both parties, it seems to me, is that this is an economy election, and that was the thrust of both of their speeches. On the question of Democrats believing that America is down at the, is in the Dust Bowl or something, look, I think a lot of that is just a generic in-party, out-party thing. I mean, if you are out of power, if you look at Bush's speeches in 2000, Dole's in 96, you have to focus on the things that are going wrong so you can criticize the guys who are in power. And then, of course, you always say, but if you elect me, they'll be much better. And Democrats did do that. I mean, I don't think the tone was pessimistic, but they are going to naturally accentuate the negative. And I think because, first of all, because they think there is a lot of negative out there, and also because that's a way of bashing Bush and McCain. And I think McCain is in this somewhat difficult position where he needs to acknowledge that people are not very happy about things, because they're not. I mean, the polling is overwhelming that Americans are pissed off. But
not so much about their own lives as they are about the direction of the country.
Well,
that's an important distinction to keep in mind.
Yes.
The numbers are far less stark when people are asked about their own lives than they are asked about the direction of the country.
Well, that's true, but I would still imagine even on people's own lives, if you compared it to where we were in the 90s, or late 90s particularly, you'd find that it's worse. On the thing about the victory part, look, Democrats don't have any problem about talking about victory in Afghanistan. It's true that they don't talk as much about victory in Iraq, because I think you're right. In their heart of hearts, they are more pessimistic than Republicans are. I think everyone is probably a bit more optimistic than they were a year ago, but I still think that probably... I take Republicans at their word that they genuinely believe that victory is in sight. I like most Democrats, don't buy that and think that there may be certain things that are going right, but that actually... that there's a lot still that there are a lot of big problems that still remain, and I don't think that I think when Democrats praise the troops, I think they're being genuine about it, and when they talk about bringing the troops home without talking about bringing them home in victory, that does reflect their different perception of the Iraq War, but not of all wars. Bush, and those guys wanted to withdraw American peacekeepers from Kosovo and Bosnia. They just said, we got to get them out of there. It's not their purpose. They weren't particularly interested in winning the peace in the former Yugoslavia because they were not as invested in those wars. I think a lot of this is just a partisan difference. The Iraq War is a very partisan war. The Republicans feel ownership over, and Democrats don't. Afghanistan is very different.
I understand what you're saying, and I think there's a lot of merit to the policy points that you're making and the sort of out-party, in-party stuff. I'm just talking about the general perceptions of a lot of people who haven't engaged in politics up until convention time. If they actually watched both conventions, and I'm not actually necessarily saying this speaks ill of Democrats even. I mean that's a perfectly honorable and noble position to say, we're the party of, what FDR would call the forgotten man, the people left out, the people who fall behind, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that's why there are liberals, right? And, and my argument with them wouldn't be about that motive whatsoever. It would be about, the efficacy of their policies, or the philosophical assumptions behind them. But in terms of just the general impression, it was amazing how downbeat the substance of what the Democrats were saying about America, and I don't mean it in an unpatriotic sense. I just mean in terms of the way they talk about the troops as if they're a bunch of sad sacks.
That's unfair. I mean, they're not talking about the troops as a bunch of sad sacks just because they don't use the word victory about Iraq. I mean, they're constantly talking about, they're constantly calling them heroes and all these kinds of... I think when historians look back at this period, what will strike them is actually how bipartisan the completely uncritical relationship between the American populace and the American military has become. I mean, I think in a lot of ways it's a good thing. It's a useful reaction to Vietnam. It has all to do with the guilt that basically couch potato Americans of both parties feel, I think, towards the small portion of the population that's actually sacrificed. But I think, the truth is that there's an unbelievable amount of piety that compared to past periods in American history, that's in a bipartisan way about the way people talk about people in uniform. And in a period in American history when a much larger percentage of Americans were in uniform or had been in uniform, I think actually people were much less pious about it because they were not so insecure. That might all be true. I'm saying is that my impression from watching it, I was struck by how much, the wounded warriors, as was one of their favorite phrases, were portrayed as victims rather than sort of heroes. I mean, that impression came across to me often. Well, you have to cite me chapter and verse on that to give it to me.
All right, I'll email you some stuff. Okay. I mean, starting out with Michelle Obama's, opening night stuff about how vital it is that we get, troops mental health care straight on through.
I don't understand. You can't believe that they are heroes and also believe that they deserve good health benefits, including mental health.
Peter, I think we're on different wavelengths. Peter, no, I'm not. Look, I'm all in favor of giving them as much mental. Anyone who's got post-traumatic stress disorder, let's throw the treasury at helping them out. I'm in favor of all those things. All I'm talking about just as a Michael Deaver kind of analysis of the impressions that these things gave. You got the sense that there was the Democrats were talking incessantly about the victims in society, economic victims, military victims, whatever, and the Republicans had a much more upbeat view. I mean, and I'm not talking about the merits of these charges whatsoever. The conventions are ultimately infomercials, right? I mean, they're about giving an impression of what the parties stand for, and I think there was a real desire to sort of talk up the situation of America as if it was vastly more dire than it is, and to cultivate grievances among people. And there was also this undertone that I think comes across in a lot of Obama's speeches that Obama and the Democrats have a certain undercurrent of wanting to fix the country, while McCain and the Republicans want to fix the government. And I think that's a distinction that people may not be able to articulate all that well, but actually has some real significance when you start talking about the sort of impressions that these parties and these candidates are going to give to the voters at the margins.
Well, I don't buy that distinction about fixing the government versus fixing the country. I mean, I think that this may be what you heard, but I think that the classic Democratic narrative that really Bill Clinton started, but which Obama is kind of now really trying to pick up as he focuses more on the economy, is that people who work hard and play by the rules and do everything right and are great, but are being affected by forces outside of their control that they cannot they cannot alone respond to successfully, and that they need help, and the help is not coming. Now, if you want to say that that's a way of talking about Americans as victims, it seems to me the alternative, I suppose, is a view that basically says that that people don't really need much government help or assistance in order to navigate these difficult problems. All they need is government to get out of the way, because government is kind of shackling them from being able to succeed. And that was that's the classic conservative argument. It was the Reagan argument. But I think it is striking that there are fewer conservatives and Republicans who are willing to make that argument in a full-throated way today, because I don't think it's where the American people are nearly as much as they were, say, in 1980.
See, but I just think, I think that's a perfectly valid defense of Bill Clinton and his rhetoric, but it's not all of that descriptive of Obama's rhetoric. But Obama talks about the need for people to change. He talks about his campaign as if it's a movement that will cause transformations within people. Michelle Obama put it quite succinctly when she said, Barack Obama is going to fix our broken souls and force Americans to work. That is a different vision. That's a very Crowleyite vision. Which is different from the Clinton vision, and I think it comes through. The Obama sort of rhetoric comes out of this community organizer stuff, and he talks to American people. He certainly talks to his own followers or his own, supporters. Although I think sometimes follower is better. He talks to them as if he is going to help, this election isn't about me, it's about you. There's a certain undercurrent of sort of self-esteem stuff about getting people to sort of change their broken ways and make themselves anew. And I think it comes out in Obama more than you're hearing.
Well, but look, first of all, I think that you were...
It's not a work hard, play by the rules shtick. It's just not.
I disagree with you. I think the vast majority of stuff is basically about how Washington is broken. You hear this from McCain too now, that ordinary Americans have to take Washington back. I really disagree with you that the thrust is about what's wrong with the average American. But, if you do, to the degree that Obama has said stuff about the fact that, that Americans need to change, even if that is also hardly a partisan Democratic thing. Think about McCain, particularly in his 2000 campaign, which is all about the fact, and even Bush, a lot of this in his 2000 campaign, all about the fact that basically Americans have lost their, aren't sacrificing, aren't serving the common good anymore, that we've become too materialistic, that we need to look out for one another more. There's a lot in what McCain says, and what McCain certainly said back in 2000, and what Bush said when he was running out of power, which was all about changing a culture of responsibility. Which is Bush's signature line in 2000? What is a culture of responsibility talking about, if not a basically slap at the culture of average America? It's not a comment on Washington.
I think there's some fairness in there. I don't, I think I'm pretty much on record. I don't like a lot of John McCain's Teddy Roosevelt cause larger than our self-interest stuff. I think it's a really terrible formulation, which I'm glad he actually fixed a little bit in his speech. Because up until his speech, and maybe he's done this lots of other times and I haven't seen it, but up until McCain's convention speech, he would often do this phrasing where it was, a cause larger than our own self-interest, and therefore we have to rally around the government or some sort of nationwide enterprise. This was the choice. It was either you're for some sort of national, federal government-run crusade, or you were only concerned with your own self-interest. And I think you hear that in both McCain and Obama. But what I liked about McCain's speech, which I have mixed views about, I was really down on it at first, and I think it actually was more effective in retrospect than I appreciated. But I hate that false choice. I am dedicated to 1,000 causes larger than my own self-interest, starting with my child, starting with my wife and my family, with the magazine I work for, with the groups I've volunteered for, with my religion, with my community, with my block. There are endless causes larger than our own self-interest that people are invested in, the Burkean little platoons of civil society. And both Obama and McCain have rhetorically framed this as you have to be with a sort of a nation-centric, government-centric movement, or, as he said to, Mitt Romney, I joined public service, my career was about patriotism, not profit, as if, what Mitt Romney did in the private sector was purely self-interested when he created, I don't know, how many new jobs, and innovations, and saved how many companies and all these sorts of things. I don't like the formulation from either of them, but I think it comes across, when McCain talks about a lot of this stuff, he talks a lot about it more about government reform. And when Obama talks about it, it has a much more movement kind of spin to it, or at least that's how my ear picks it up.
Well, we should probably move on to the last topic, but the only point I would just make is that I think there is a different kind of language about that Americans need to change, which is not even particularly related to government efforts, and that's where I think when you think about Bush's culture of responsibility stuff, which was basically just a claim that basically 60s values had infected Americans, and Americans needed to get back to the Ozzie and Harriet, better values of the greatest generation kind of thing. And I don't think that is about government, but I definitely think it's about trying to get Americans to change.
Yeah, maybe so. We should move on, though.
Should we talk about Palin or what the vice presidential picks mean? What do you think we should...
Well, I don't think we can talk about one without talking about the other,
okay.
Right?
Well, let me...
All right, so what's your take on Palin? I think most people know what my take on Palin is.
I guess the first thing is, I think that Palin shows what a kind of wild and crazy guy McCain is. I mean, I think that a McCain presidency would be, whatever you want to say, it would be interesting. And I think that Obama has this surface kind of really kind of interesting, unusual background. But the truth is, I think at his heart, he's a much more cautious person than McCain is. McCain has a kind of more conventional view, but I think the Biden thing was a very cautious move, done after checking all the boxes and all the T's. The Palin thing is just wild. I mean, the way they did it, the last-minute kind of seat-of-the-pants thing, choosing someone who totally undermines the rationale for your candidacy, it may well have worked, but, makes me think the guy might bomb Iran, because he just, he seems to be a guy who really, for better or for worse, really follows his own drummer. So I think that's the first thing that I think is interesting about Palin.
What it says about
McCain.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I don't wholeheartedly dispute that. I think it was certainly a Hail Mary pass or a long bomb or whatever the right football metaphor is. We've had a debate about this at the corner. And it was certainly...
But the Hail Mary is too religious, the reference? Is that the problem?
Well, no, the Hail Mary is something that you just chuck right before you get tackled. And the long bomb is, a strategic...
I see.
...kind of thing. I do not want to get dragged down into that debate, though. One friend of mine said it was more like the West Coast offense, and now we are reaching right up into the wild frontiers of my football articulateness. Regardless, I think it certainly was an enormous risk-reward thing going on here. And... I think that that he did this blind kind of thing has been overhyped. He's always been very impressed with the woman, and she was vetted. As far as I can tell, about 95% of the various sort of rumors or innuendos or just sloppy reporting about things bad about Palin have turned out not to be true. She's not a creationist. She's not a Buchananite. She's not. She didn't try to ban books in a local library. She wasn't against funding sex ed.
But the vetting did happen at the very last minute, didn't it? The day before, basically. The
last 6 people were vetted. The vetting process kept going, as at least as I understand it, and I think it's definitely true from the people I've talked to in the McCain campaign that, and it has been widely reported. It's not like I'm breaking news here, that he really did want Lieberman and just couldn't do it. Wouldn't work. And so, but I think some of this stuff, where I think it's overblown is, like you said, and Krauthammer's made this argument that the entire rationale for his campaign was this experience thing, and I don't for a moment think that the McCain campaign was going to run on experience alone straight through the fall. I don't think that was ever the plan. And if it was the plan, it wouldn't have worked. Admittedly, it's a bit of an apples and orange thing, but it didn't work for Hillary. It wouldn't. It'd be even dumber to do in a change election in the general election, and so. And it is not. It is hardly as if McCain is the first president to unload or launch a new theme for the general election. That's what conventions are for half the time. Is to rebrand yourself for the fall campaign after locking up the nomination. And it always seemed to me that it was going to be in the cards that he was going to run as this maverick reformer. I had to do this what's called charticle for the LA Times on the Republican vice presidential field, and Jonathan Chait did the one for the Republicans for the LA Times. And I remember when I was going through this and calling these people about Veep picks and all the rest, I agree with you that Biden checks off the boxes that Obama felt he needed to check off, but Obama had very few boxes. He had to pick basically a solid white guy who has some appeal to working class white men. I mean,
and had national security experience.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I sort of lumped that in with a solid thing, but yeah, by Biden, someone shy of Sam Nunn, that kind of thing. That's all he really needed to do, or at least those were the boxes that he felt he needed to check off. If you actually started to go and look at all the boxes that McCain had to check off, someone who could excite the base, someone who could add a sort of gee whiz quality to the campaign, someone who would reinforce the reformer stuff. You go down the list, and the only box that she really can't check at all is the foreign policy experience one. And so I just don't think it was as outrageous for him to sort of pick someone who bolsters all these other things that he wanted to bolster, if it undermines somewhat the experience thing, particularly when the experience of vice presidents is not something that people actually vote for. I mean, I think Obama made an incredibly bad pick with Biden. I know you're a fan of his, but I think Biden is a terrible pick for Obama. And meanwhile, Palin, I think so far, proves that actually his judgment, at least his political judgment, and the thing is, everyone thought his foreign policy judgment was sort of okay with McCain.
Well,
what is amazing is it turns out
not everybody, to be fair.
But you know what I mean. I mean, there's that was not where he was considered to be weak. From Georgia and all that kind of stuff. That was something that he was going to own as one of his issues was his foreign policy judgment, and he wasn't going to apologize for it to anybody. But his political judgment, even his friends thought he had terrible political judgment. And the fact that he actually pulled the trigger on Palin was very reassuring to a lot of people. And I agree with you that it's a risky thing and could still implode. But so far, it seems to have paid off, very, very well. I think it is actually, everyone's complaining about how she's not going before the press. I guess she's going to do a Charlie Gibson thing on Wednesday. I think they're playing this brilliantly. Because once again, this expectations game is working to her advantage. I think she's going to do very well, with the press. Yes, she's going to get nailed on some, who's the foreign minister of Uzbekistan kind of questions and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, I think McCain wanted to reinforce the maverick reformer thing, which was what he was planning on running on in the fall anyway. And this pick lets him do it in spades.
Well, I agree with some of that, but not all of it. I mean, I think you're right that McCain could not run only on experience. And that you're right. It was natural for him to try to reinforce the maverick thing, or another version of the maverick thing would have been the nonpartisan thing that a Lieberman choice would have accentuated more. But the main attack on Obama has been the experience thing. I mean, there's also been this he's a celebrity kind of stuff. But
and that worked. They weakened Obama with that stuff.
Well, I think it's true. So far, it's looked more successful than I would have imagined. But so it does. I think it does undermine the focus of the attack on Obama. I don't totally agree with you that Obama's choice was so predetermined of Biden, because although you look at the three candidates who seem to be at the top, Kaine, and Biden. First of all, it was not so self-evident that Obama was going to choose a guy with national security experience, because there was the option of choosing someone who was also outside of Washington and who could have strengthened the sense of being an outsider. And that would have probably been a governor who didn't have national security experience. There was also the idea of choosing someone younger in the way that Clinton chose Gore to kind of show a generational change. He didn't do that. The Biden pick was more like a Cheney pick than a Gore pick. And I
agree with that.
And I think it was partly, obviously, because he wanted to, reinforce the national security stuff. After Georgia, maybe they felt that was an issue. But I actually think, to give Obama credit, just as I think Bush chose Cheney because he thought Cheney would actually really help him govern, God help us. I think Obama really chose Biden over Bai and Kane because he thought that Biden was actually someone who would be a lot more helpful in governing because he's been around Congress so much and because he's considered to be someone who's thought a lot about foreign policy issues. And I think that reflects well on him. The only point on Palin I would make is that I think there are two boxes that she doesn't fill. The one is obviously the national security experience, but the other one is, can she talk compellingly in policy terms about the economy? I mean, we know that she can maybe she can feel your pain or kind of identify with people or husbands in a labor union, blah, blah, blah. But I still do think that would have been Romney's asset, was that he would have been able to make a really good, strong version of the conservative case that we're the guys who can get America back on track economically. And with McCain and Palin, I'm still not sure, after listening to those speeches, that I really know what they want to do particularly, or if they want to just kind of drill and cut taxes. I don't know that either of them speak about that issue with a lot of passion or a lot of specificity, a lot of kind of command.
I certainly think that's fair. I mean, again, we could do a whole segment on why I think Biden is a disastrous pick totally, at minimum, totally unhelpful pick. And I don't think that the Cheney thing. I mean, I think where you're wrong about the Cheney thing, I agree that he's Obama's Cheney. But I also think there was a political angle to the Cheney thing.
Oh, to the Cheney pick.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a reinforcement. Don't worry.
Yes,
we've got this.
Right.
This tough-talking, substantive guy from, the sort of glory years of previous administrations, and he's sort of the rock who is going to he reassured the base in an enormous way. Cheney. I mean, there was a political aspect to it too.
Yeah. I'm not saying the Biden thing doesn't have a political aspect. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, your Cheney analogy made it sound as if that was that. And you're right, it may reflect well that was one of the factors about governance and all of the rest. Although I think, Palin could actually end up being useful as a sort of, sending, if a lot of the trends that are going on now continue, which is a huge if, she could end up being very useful in governing in terms of both being a liaison to the right, because McCain's going to have huge problems with his base once he's elected, and also sort of being the going into the lion's den in Congress and making these Democratic bulls running the committees try to tear her apart. And I don't think the optics of that would work very well. I don't think. I mean, you have every reason to be dubious about her ability to talk convincingly on public policy because we haven't seen it. I've seen her speak in person. I've watched you should look them up on C-SPAN. She did these debates for the governor's race in Alaska. She can do the nitty-gritty of public policy. She may have to get up to speed on some of the public policy stuff at the national level, but her ability to talk intelligently about international energy markets, the effects of taxes, the regulations in her own state is pretty impressive. And it depends. We'll find out how quick a study she is on some of this stuff. But my guess is that she's going to be a lot more effective than a lot of Democrats are hoping on that front.
Well, you're right. Expectations are certainly low.
Yeah, and that's to her. That's to her advantage.
I agree.
So I mean, so I think one of the things it said about it's so funny. There's a real mirror image thing going on in that Obama picks this Washington insider when he's been claiming to be the outsider. Yeah. McCain, the Washington insider, in effect, although far more of a troublemaker than Biden is, picks this true outsider. And I think in terms of, there's an inherent tension in Obama because he's been running as this, this new Coke, this fresh, innovative, maybe not revolutionary, although a lot of his supporters, use revolutionary rhetoric about what he means. This sort of turn the page guy, and he goes and picks a guy, from like 5 chapters back on a very old page in Joe Biden. And it highlights this tension that exists with Obama's candidacy generally. He has to choose in a way, or maybe he doesn't think he has to choose, but right now he's straddling. He's trying to convince the voters that he's a generic Democrat, while all the while, for about a year and a half, he was running as anything but a generic Democrat. And I'll just say for the record, when it comes to these themes about post-partisanship or bipartisanship, about reform, Obama's record versus Palin's doesn't remotely stack up. Obama never challenged the corrupt Chicago machine in any significant way. That ethics reform bill he passed in Congress was not a very big deal. None of his bipartisan efforts when he wasn't running for president in the Senate were a very big deal. And what Palin did, going after the Republican machine in Alaska, was a huge deal. Was a very big deal and took a lot more courage for an Alaska politician. I mean, I know this stuff. My wife's from Alaska. I go up there at least once a year. That place is a Republican welfare state up there. And for her to do what she did, she is the real version of all of the rhetoric you hear from Obama. He gives great speeches about bipartisanship. He's shown very, very little of it when it matters. She is more than done by. She's taken on the Republican apparatus in Alaska more aggressively than McCain took on the Republican apparatus in Washington.
Well, I'm not sure actually in the last couple of years, in the last few years, you can say that McCain actually has been that aggressive.
That's fine. He's been running for president. I agree. But Barack Obama's been running for president almost from the day he got to the Senate. So he hasn't done anything in terms of really taking on the machinery of his party.
I think I think it partly has to do with what machinery you're talking about. I mean, this is a much longer conversation that we're going to get into, but I basically take the view that, and I think a lot of Democrats take the view, that the machinery of Washington is K Street, representing the wealthy and large corporate interests. And that a McCain-Palin administration would be very interesting to see whether they put some balance in there. Did they choose people in the interior departments and the energy departments, who were basically not coming straight from these trade association groups? But the Democratic Party, you will violently disagree with this, but the Democratic Party, in general, it seems to me, is not nearly beholden to those interests. You may think the interests they are beholden to, trial lawyers, labor unions, environmentalists, are equally the kind of nasty, vicious machinery that we should be trying to get out of Washington, but that's not the way I see it. The way I see it is that, in fact, the entrenched Washington interests that I am concerned about are basically K Street, and it's mostly the corporate and business community, and I think any Democratic administration is going to move you quite significantly away from that. I think McCain and a McCain-Palin administration is a very interesting open question about whether they would be like a Bush administration or they would be an administration that Grover Norquist would be very unhappy about. And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that Grover Norquist is unhappy with Obama.
I think that's fine. I disagree with you. I think McCain is going to give Grover Norquist headaches like you wouldn't believe. I mean, it's not like McCain didn't brag about putting Abramoff in jail. And I don't think anybody who knows McCain thinks that he doesn't actually believe this reformer stuff. That said, none of what you just said, none of it, lends any credence to the idea that Obama is a bipartisan guy, a post-partisan guy, a reformer who is willing to take on interests that aren't beholden to his own party. He talks that way, but there is almost no record of him doing anything like that. And you may be absolutely right in your benignly biased partisan Democrat or liberal point of view that all of the corruption lies elsewhere and that the Democrats have a perfectly focused eye on where the corruption is and it's not in their own camp and where the problems are and all of the rest. And you may be right. I don't think you are, but you may be right. But none of that lends any credibility to the idea that Obama is a different kind of Democrat.
I guess
he's running as a partisan Democrat. He's voted 97% party line in the Senate. He is not this post-partisan guy. And I think that reality is very dangerous to him.
Well, I think that to some degree we're conflating different things. Obama, at his most successful, we don't know whether he's going to achieve this in the next 2 months or during his presidency, would be like Reagan, which is to say, Reagan was not a centrist. He was not a bipartisan, post-partisan guy. He was a conservative Republican who, because of the way he was able to present himself, the way he was able to package issues in his own particular persona, was able to actually reach much deeper into the Democratic base than Republicans like George H.W. Bush, who were actually more centrist. That is, if you're interested in constructing a Democratic majority, that's the promise of Obama, that he's a liberal who could, for various reasons, poach a lot of people who are now voting Republican. We don't know if that'll be successful or not, but that's what he's trying to do. I don't think he's ever claimed that he's the guy who's trying to split the difference between Democrats and Republicans, a la, I don't know, Max Baucus or some very conservative Democrat.
Look, Biden highlights a fundamental problem. He's been saying, you can't go to Washington and just put the same faces in new seats kind of thing. That he's used that line a million times, and he picked Biden, who is precisely the same old face we've seen forever. This trial lawyer, credit card company senator from Delaware, who now miraculously is from Scranton. And I understand why you guys would hope and pray that he's a progressive Reagan, and that's fine. But his rhetoric about appealing to Republicans, about being a post-partisan guy, about reaching across the aisle. How many times have we heard him brag about reaching across the aisle about ethics reform and working with, what's his name, Tom whatever, and how many times have we heard him talk about his bipartisan work with Lugar? There's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of PR about him being a bipartisan, post-partisan guy, and he's not one. And he has not sold himself as a progressive Reagan. Maybe he sold liberals on this. Maybe this is the bargain his liberal has. But that is not what his rhetoric has been. And the reality is that the rhetoric that Obama uses to describe why he should be president of the United States, the ability to reach across the aisle and all of that kind of stuff, applies far better to McCain and to Palin than it does to Obama and Biden.
Well, we could go on and on about this. I think to some degree...
And we will, because we're debating around the country for the next couple months.
That's true. You're right. So we will. Pity the country. But I think, first of all, that you are presenting the Biden thing in ways that I think are a little bit too simple. The reality is, this is maybe political consultant speak, is that what Obama needs to present is reassuring change. In a way, that's what McCain needs as well. It's just that McCain already had, you could argue, the reassuring part. He needed to bolster the change part. Obama had the change part, needed to bolster the reassuring part. It's true that Biden kind of undermines the change thing a little bit, but you could argue that Obama needed that, because what he needed was, in the same way that George Bush needed, was that when Cheney made Bush reassuring change, because Bush was already confident that people would perceive him as change. On the question of Obama being a bipartisan, he hasn't been around in politics very long. I would certainly concede that I think Obama is, in the way he views things, he is not a conservative Democrat. He's not really. He is basically, I think, fairly typical in his views of kind of where post-Clinton liberals are, which I think is not on the far left, but is certainly more liberal than it is conservative. But I disagree with you I think a lot of Obama's effort has been to suggest that he can move beyond polarizing cultural issues by saying that they're not important, in a way that, in a kind of E.J. Dionne style way, saying that they are basically been a distraction, not by ceding the liberal position, but basically saying that these are trivial, and moving on to core economic issues where I think he believes the country is actually ready for more activist government. He may be wrong in that, but that's how I perceive the Obama strategy.
That's fine. But it seems to me, you may be right, you may be wrong, but there's a lot of audacity of hope in what you're saying, because I'm going by what he's actually saying in his speeches and how he campaigns and how he acted in the 22 debates in the primaries, and your stage direction may be entirely accurate, But the lines he actually read said very little.
I don't know. I think I read more. I heard more of that than you did in the way he talked about issues like abortion and guns, which had a kind of let's agree to disagree kind of quality to them. But he said so much.
Abortion's going to be. Here's a prediction for blogging: is abortion's going to end up being a big problem for Obama. But anyway, we'll just leave that.
I won't make the requisite abortion being a problem for Palin joke.
Yeah, no, I look forward to the debate about who's more extreme on abortion, Sarah Palin or Barack Obama, who's to the left of NARAL. But
well, maybe we'll have that debate.
My guess is we will. All right, I jumped on your last line there, so if you have anything else you want to add,
that's it.
All right, my friend, I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.